The morning they killed my grandfather's Berm, Vivian Kessler stood on top of the diesel excavator's tracks in 4-inch heels and said, "That eyesore hill is coming down whether you like it or not, Mr. Dunmore. The board voted 6-1. Progress doesn't wait for old fences." I want you to sit with those numbers for a second, because they're going to matter. 40 lots, $6.2 million in pre-sale contracts signed before a single shovel of dirt moved. $840,000 in consulting fees that never went to any consultant a human being could find. And 108 years. That's how long my family's flood berm had stood along Alamo Seco Arroyo, quietly doing its job, before a woman with a clipboard decided it was an eyesore blocking her clubhouse view. By the time the first real monsoon of that August finished pounding the high desert, Vivian Kessler would owe more than $7 million in restitution. And here's the thing, almost none of that money was for the flood damage. What none of them knew standing there that morning, watching the last curve of my grandfather's hand-built earthwork get chewed into a flat pad of red dirt, was that I still held a drainage easement dated April 1908, recorded in ink that had outlived 3 courthouses. I didn't say a word. I just took out my phone, checked the time, 9:14 a.m., a Tuesday, and started recording. If you're watching this, I want to know where you're tuning in from tonight. Drop it in the comments. And ask yourself something before we get going. If a stranger with a clipboard and a smile told you the hill your grandfather built with his own hands and a borrowed mule team was unsightly, what would you do? Would you fight? Would you fold? Because I'll tell you right now, I did neither. I did something slower, something with paperwork. My name's Walt Dunmore. I'm 62 years old, and for 31 years I was a hydrologist for the State Water Resources Board before I retired to run cattle on land that's been in my family since Theodore Roosevelt was still shaking hands in Texas. I know how water moves across dry ground better than most men know their own children. And on that Tuesday morning in April, standing at the fence line watching that excavator eat through a century of engineering, I understood something Vivian Kessler didn't. She thought she was grading a hill. She was actually signing a receipt. My grandfather, Silas Dunmore, came out here in 1906 with $40, a wagon, and a wife who could shoot straighter than he could. He homesteaded 1,100 acres of high desert scrub above a dry wash the old Spanish land grants called Alamo Seco, the dry cottonwood. Most years it stayed exactly that, dry. But every few summers, when the monsoon clouds stacked up purple and heavy over the mountains to the west, that arroyo would come alive with more water than most people could imagine crossing flat desert ground. Silas watched it happen twice before he understood what he was looking at. The third time, in the summer of 1908, he spent 4 months building a berm. Not fancy, not engineered on paper by anybody with a diploma. Just packed earth and river rock, 12 feet at its widest base, running in a long curved shoulder along the north bank of that arroyo, turning floodwater away from the low ground and out toward open desert where it could spread and soak in without hurting a soul. He built it with a mule-drawn scraper and his own 2 hands, and when he was done, he did something that mattered more than the dirt itself. He rode into the county seat and recorded a drainage easement on that berm, April 1908, in his name, tied to the water rights on our land. My father kept that paper in a cedar box. I keep it in a fireproof safe now, but I know every word of it by heart. The ranch house table where I still eat breakfast was built by my father in 1947 out of mesquite wood so hard it dulled 3 saw blades, and if you run your hand along the underside, you can still feel where he carved his initials before he ever got married. There are 3 generations of Dunmores buried under a stand of cottonwoods a quarter mile from that house. Silas, my father Ray, and my mother Etta, who died the same week I retired from the state job, like she was waiting for me to come home before she let go. The land still smells the way it did when I was a boy. Diesel from the old tractor mixed with cut hay in the fall, dust and creosote after a hot afternoon, and underneath all of it, always, that mineral smell of dry riverbed waiting for rain. I don't look like much. I drive a 22-year-old Ford with a cracked windshield, and I wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. Most folks who meet me figure I'm just some old rancher scraping by on Social Security and cattle prices. That's fine by me. Let them think it. Vivian Kessler never made that mistake about herself. She made sure nobody would. She drove a brand new Range Rover the color of wet slate, wore blazers that cost more than my truck payment, and carried a clipboard everywhere like it was a badge of office, which, in a way, it was, since she'd been president of the Rio Seco Estates Homeowners Association for 6 years running, unopposed, because nobody else wanted the headache. She had a real estate license, a talent for smiling while she talked over you, and, I'd learn later, a very specific relationship with a development company called Cortland Ridge Partners that most of her neighbors had never heard of. Rio Seco Estates sat in the low ground below my ranch, a subdivision of 110 stucco houses built starting in the early 2000s, right in the natural floodplain of Alamo Seco Arroyo. Every single one of those homeowners had a title report somewhere in a drawer that mentioned the drainage easement upstream. Almost none of them had ever read it. Why would they? For 6 years running, the water had always gone around them, quiet as a held breath, because a dead man's berm was still doing exactly what he built it to do. Vivian wanted a clubhouse. Specifically, she wanted 40 new, premier view lots, carved out of the graded flat where that berm used to sit, each one marketed with a picture of open desert sunset views that, as far as I could tell, nobody had bothered to check would still exist once the rains came. That Tuesday morning, she stood on the tracks of that excavator, with her clipboard against her chest like a shield, sunlight flashing off a wristwatch that cost more than my last 3 years of property tax, and she smiled at me the way you smile at a slow dog. "You should really thank us, Mr. Dunmore," she said. "We're improving the whole viewshed. Increases everybody's property values, yours included." I didn't answer her. I just watched the machine take one more bite out of a hill my grandfather built by hand, and I thought about the cedar box sitting in my fireproof safe back at the house, and I thought, quietly, the way you think about a hand you haven't shown yet at the card table. You have no idea what you just did. 2 weeks after they finished grading my grandfather's berm into a flat red scar, a certified letter showed up in my mailbox. I remember the time because I check my mail every day at exactly the same hour, an old habit from 31 years of state work where paperwork ran your life whether you liked it or not. Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. Hot enough that the aluminium mailbox door burned my fingers. Inside was a single sheet of HOA letterhead, Rio Seco Estates Community Association, with a violation number and a dollar figure that made me laugh out loud, alone standing in my own driveway. $4,200. The letter cited hazardous debris and non-conforming earthwork on a stretch of ground the association now claimed fell inside their common area easement, the same ground my grandfather's berm had occupied for over a century, the same ground they themselves had just bulldozed flat 2 weeks earlier. They were fining me for the remains of my own dead grandfather's flood control structure, the parts their excavator hadn't finished chewing up, and threatening to file a lien against my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. I want you to understand something most homeowners never learn until it's too late. In Texas, a homeowners association cannot simply invent authority over land it doesn't own or hold a recorded easement across. Under Texas Property Code, Chapter 209, the Texas Residential Property Owners Protection Act, any assessment, fine, or lien an HOA tries to impose has to trace back to a validly recorded declaration and a clearly defined boundary. My 1,100 acres had never been part of Rio Seco Estates, never signed a covenant, never paid a dime of dues. I wasn't a member of their association any more than the mountains behind my house were. But I didn't call a lawyer that day. I didn't even call the county. I did what I'd done for 3 decades every time some contractor or rancher swore up and down a floodplain map was wrong. I documented. I photographed the letter, front and back, timestamp burned into the corner. I photographed my own property line survey pins, still standing exactly where the county surveyor drove them in 1994. I drove out to the graded pad myself, camera in hand, and took 41 pictures of exactly where the old berm's footprint sat relative to my fence line, GPS coordinates logged on every single one. Then I drove to the Rio Seco Estates Clubhouse trailer. They hadn't built the real one yet, just a construction office with air conditioning and a folding table, and I asked to speak to the board president. Vivian Kessler came out from the back wearing a cream-colored blazer, that same clipboard against her hip like it had grown there, and she smiled at me the exact way she'd smiled from the top of that excavator. "Mr. Dunmore, I was hoping we could resolve this without drama." "There's no drama, Ms. Kessler," I said. "I'd just like to understand how your association has authority to fine me for land that's never been inside your boundary." She flipped open a folder on the clipboard, pulled out a photocopy, and slid it across the table like she was dealing me a losing hand. "Our surveyor updated the plat last year. The common area boundary was adjusted. It's all here, notarized." I looked at that page for a long moment. The notary stamp was dated 14 months earlier. The surveyor's name I didn't recognize, and the boundary line drawn on it cut directly through the middle of a parcel that had been recorded, unchanged, since 1994. A parcel with my grandfather's easement sitting right in the metadata if anyone had bothered to pull the original filing instead of drawing a new line on a fresh sheet of paper and calling it history. "This isn't a survey," I said quietly. "This is a drawing." "It's a legally adopted plat amendment, Mr. Dunmore." Her voice didn't rise, but something under it went flat and hard, like desert ground right before you find out it's actually caliche rock 2 inches down. "The board approved it unanimously. If you'd like to contest it, you're welcome to hire counsel. In the meantime, the fine stands, and it accrues interest." I folded the fake plat and put it in my shirt pocket, next to my own photographs. "You have a nice day," I told her, and I meant it, because I already knew I was going to enjoy the next few months more than she could imagine. Here's what most homeowners don't know. A plat amendment isn't worth the paper it's printed on, unless it's been properly filed with the county clerk and cross-referenced against every existing recorded easement on that parcel. Under Texas Local Government Code, Chapter 232, subdivision plats require county commissioner approval, not just a board vote in a construction trailer. So the first thing I did, the very next morning, was drive 40 minutes to the county courthouse and pull every document on file for both my property and Rio Seco Estates, going back to statehood if I had to. I didn't have to go back that far. I only had to go back to 1908. The clerk's office still had the original hand-drawn survey plat my grandfather filed alongside his easement. The ink faded to rust brown, but every line still legible under the microfilm reader. Drainage easement, Grantor Silas T. Dunmore, recorded April 14, 1908, Volume 3, page 61. It described, in the careful surveyor's language of a man who'd probably never gone past 6th grade, a berm and drainage right-of-way running along the north bank of Alamo Seco Arroyo, granted in perpetuity, binding on all successors and assigns. Binding on all successors and assigns. That phrase sat in my chest like a swallowed stone the rest of that day. There was no amendment to it, no release, no quitclaim. Nobody in 108 years had ever bought that easement out or extinguished it, because nobody had ever needed to. The berm just sat there, quietly doing its job, decade after decade, until Vivian Kessler decided it was in the way of a view. I made copies of everything. Then, because 31 years with the state teaches you that money always leaves a trail even when people are careful, I started pulling the HOA's own filings. Meeting minutes, budget disclosures, the subdivision's original developer agreement from 2003. And that's where I found the second thing, the thing that turned this from a property dispute into something else entirely. Cortland Ridge Partners, LLC. 40 new residential lots, platted directly over the graded berm footprint. Filed for pre-sale marketing 11 months before the county had even approved the underlying land use change. Pre-sale contracts totaling $6.2 million. Buyer deposits already collected and sitting in escrow. And nested inside the HOA's own financial disclosure, buried in a line item labeled Engineering and Consulting Services, a payment of $840,000 routed to something called Sunbelt Advisory Group LLC, a company registered 8 months earlier at a residential address that, when I looked it up, turned out to belong to Vivian Kessler's sister. I sat in my truck in that courthouse parking lot for a long time with the engine off, the desert heat pressing through the windshield, and I thought about the word she'd used 2 weeks earlier. Progress doesn't wait for old fences. She hadn't torn down my grandfather's berm because it was ugly. She'd torn it down because it was sitting on top of $6 million. It was around that same week I met Dorothy Vance. She lived 3 houses down from the graded pad in a little stucco house with a wheelchair ramp her late husband had built himself before the cancer took him, and an oxygen concentrator that hummed all day and all night from the front window. Dorothy was 78 years old, a widow, and before she married her husband, she'd spent 2 years as an army nurse at Fort Sam Houston, patching up boys coming home from places she still wouldn't talk about. She had a small flag on a pole by her mailbox, faded from 20 years of sun, and a habit of watering the same 3 rose bushes every morning at 7, rain or no rain. I only found out about Dorothy because Vivian's board tried to use her against me. They sent Dorothy a letter of her own that same month, a violation notice for an unauthorized modification, namely the wheelchair ramp her husband had built for her 15 years earlier, now suddenly deemed non-conforming under the Revised Community Aesthetic Guidelines. Fine, $600 a month until removed. On a fixed income of $1,100, that letter might as well have been an eviction notice. I found out because Dorothy showed up at my fence line one evening, walking slow with a cane in one hand and that letter in the other, asking me, a stranger practically, if I knew a lawyer, because she'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that I was fighting the same board and maybe I'd know what to do. I read her letter twice, then I looked at the date on it. It had gone out the same week the board voted to approve the Cortland Ridge pre-sale contracts. "Mrs. Vance," I said, "I think they're trying to make an example out of you, so the rest of the neighborhood stays quiet while they finish something a lot bigger than your ramp." She looked at me with the kind of tired, clear-eyed patience only people who've buried a husband and served their country ever really carry, and she said, "Mr. Dunmore, I've been dealing with people who think a scared old woman is an easy problem to solve since before you were shaving. You go ahead and tell me what you need." That was the night I decided this wasn't just going to be a fight over a fence line and 40 acres of dry ground anymore. I didn't tell Vivian Kessler what I'd found in that courthouse. I didn't tell the board, didn't tell Dorothy the full shape of it yet either. 31 years working for the state teaches you that the moment you show your hand, the other side starts shredding paper. So I sat on it. I made copies of copies, mailed one set to myself certified so the postmark would hold up in court, and I kept a second set in a safety deposit box 40 miles away in a bank that had nothing to do with anybody local. Then I waited for the sky to do what I already knew it was going to do. I'd spent 31 years reading rainfall data for this exact stretch of desert. Alamo Seco Arroyo doesn't flood every year, but when the monsoon pattern sets up right, a wet June pushing moisture up from the Gulf, a ridge of high pressure parking itself over New Mexico just so, it floods hard and it floods fast. I checked the National Weather Service outlooks every morning that July, the way other men check stock prices. By the last week of the month, the models were lining up. A slow-moving cell was going to sit right over the western mountains, and everything that fell up there was going to come down through that arroyo in a matter of hours. I filed for something first, a floodplain development permit inquiry with the county engineer's office, on record, time-stamped, asking a simple question. Had anyone verified that regrading the historic berm complied with Texas Water Code Section 11.086, which prohibits diverting or impounding surface water in a manner that damages the property of another? I made sure that inquiry was on paper, in the county's system, 3 full weeks before the storm ever formed. I wanted a clean, boring, undeniable record that I had raised the alarm through the proper legal channel before a single drop of rain fell. Most people skip that step because it feels like nothing. It's not nothing. It's a timestamp that proves you didn't wait for a disaster to manufacture your case. I also sent a certified letter, return receipt requested, directly to the HOA board and to Cortland Ridge Partners, care of their registered agent, informing them formally that the graded area sat within a recorded 1908 drainage easement and that any structure or grading in that footprint proceeded at their own legal risk. I didn't threaten anybody. I didn't mention the money I'd found. I just quoted the recording volume and page number, quoted Texas Water Code section 11.086, and asked them to acknowledge receipt. They never acknowledged it. But the postal tracking number showed delivery, signature obtained, 11 days before the storm. Here's what most homeowners don't know. In Texas, once you've given a party formal written notice of a known hazard and they proceed anyway, that notice becomes powerful evidence of negligence, sometimes even gross negligence, if damage follows. I wasn't building a lawsuit yet. I was building a record. There's a difference, and it's the difference between a man who reacts and a man who waits. 2 days after that letter arrived, Dorothy Vance called me at 6 in the morning, her voice tight and higher than usual. "Walt, you need to come down here, now." I found 4 men in orange vests standing in Dorothy's front yard with a reciprocating saw, cutting through the aluminium railing of her husband's wheelchair ramp, while a 5th man in a golf shirt with a Rio Seco Estates lanyard supervised from the sidewalk with his arms crossed. Dorothy stood in her doorway in her bathrobe, oxygen tube looped over her ears, gripping the door frame because without that ramp, she had no way down to the walkway at all. "Stop," I said, loud enough that the man with the saw actually flinched and cut the trigger. "HOA enforcement order," the golf shirt man said, holding up a laminated card like it was a badge. "Board-approved removal of non-conforming structures effective today." I already had my phone out, recording, timestamp 6:41 a.m., burned into the corner of the frame. "You're removing an ADA-compliant medical accessibility structure from a disabled veteran's home without a court order," I said, keeping my voice level, the same tone I used to use testifying in front of state committees. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and Texas Property Code, Section 202.004, an association cannot enforce a restriction that discriminates against a resident's disability accommodation without a judicial finding. "You are on video right now. I suggest you stop." The golf shirt man's face did something complicated, somewhere between annoyance and the first flicker of understanding that this might not go the way the morning meeting had promised him it would. But he looked at his phone, got a text, and looked back up with a kind of forced confidence. "Board president's on her way. She says proceed." Vivian Kessler arrived 9 minutes later in the Range Rover, parking it half on Dorothy's lawn, stepping out in workout clothes this time, hair still damp, clearly pulled straight from somewhere else. She didn't even look at Dorothy standing in the doorway. She looked at me. "Mr. Dunmore, this doesn't concern you. It concerns me the moment you start cutting apart a war veteran's home while she's standing in the doorway, unable to get down her own steps," I said. "I've got this on video. Cameras rolling. You want to tell me again, on the record, that the board approved removing a wheelchair ramp from a 78-year-old widow?" For just a second, and I want you to understand I've replayed this moment in my head 100 times since, Vivian's composure actually cracked. Something raw and impatient showed through, the mask of the clipboard and the smile slipping just enough that I saw what was underneath it. Not malice exactly, something colder than malice. Indifference dressed up as authority. "The guidelines are the guidelines," she snapped. "If she can't maintain a conforming property, that's not my problem to solve. Finish the removal." She said it directly into the frame of my phone camera. I made sure of that before I ever raised it. The man with the saw hesitated, looked at me, looked at his supervisor, and made a choice that told me everything about how this whole operation actually worked underneath the polish. He finished the cut. The ramp railing clattered to the concrete. Dorothy made a small sound in her throat, not quite a cry, more like the sound of someone absorbing one more unfairness in a life that had already handed her more than her share. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten Vivian Kessler with anything in that moment, because threats are for people who don't already have a plan. I just lowered my phone, looked at her, and said, "Thank you." She blinked. "For what?" "For that," I said, nodding at the camera. "That's going to matter a great deal, and soon." She laughed at me, actually laughed, short and sharp, before she turned and walked back to her Range Rover, calling over her shoulder that I could post it on the internet for all she cared. Nobody outside this county was ever going to see it anyway. I stayed behind and helped Dorothy's neighbor build a temporary plywood ramp out of scrap lumber from my own barn. Good enough to get her down her steps until something more permanent could go up. Dorothy sat in a kitchen chair on her porch while I worked, oxygen concentrator humming through the open window, and she watched me measure boards with the same steady attention I imagine she once gave to soldiers' charts. "You've got something on that woman," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've got a few things," I told her. "You gonna use them?" I thought about the certified letter sitting unacknowledged in Vivian Kessler's file. I thought about Sunbelt Advisory Group and the $840,000. I thought about the drought-cracked sky to the west and the National Weather Service outlook I'd checked that very morning before Dorothy's call came in, showing a 70% chance of severe thunderstorms building over the western ranges within the week. "Mrs. Vance," I said, driving the last screw into the plywood, "I've spent 31 years learning exactly how water finds the fastest way downhill. I'm not going to do a single illegal thing to that woman. I don't have to." I looked west, toward the mountains, where the first stack of afternoon clouds was already building tall and dark against a sky that had been empty blue for 3 straight weeks. "I'm just going to let the sky do what it's always done," I said, "and make sure the county, the sheriff, and about half of Rio Seco estates are standing there with cameras when it does." The storm broke on a Thursday, the second week of August, right on schedule with the National Weather Service model I'd been watching for 3 straight weeks. I want you to picture it the way I saw it that afternoon, standing on the ridge above my grandfather's old Berm site with a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and 3 men standing beside me who weren't there by accident. To my left stood Hank Ruiz, the county floodplain administrator, holding a clipboard of his own, a real one, with real authority behind it, there because my written inquiry 3 weeks earlier had triggered a mandatory site inspection under the county's floodplain management ordinance. To my right stood Deputy Marcus Ellery from the county sheriff's office, there because I'd called ahead and told him, calmly, that a documented drainage hazard was likely to produce property damage that afternoon, and I wanted law enforcement present for the record. And beside him, holding a shoulder-mounted camera with the local NBC affiliate's logo on the side, stood a reporter named Priya Chandra, who I'd called 2 days earlier and told, simply, "I think you're going to want to be here Thursday afternoon." At 2:47 p.m. That exact time again, the same hour that fake letter had once burned my fingers in my own mailbox 2 months earlier, we heard it before we saw it. A low sound, like a freight train running underground, rolling down out of the mountains to the west. Then the wall of water came around the bend of Alamo Seco Arroyo, brown and thick with churned earth, moving faster than any of us standing there had expected, even though I'd spent 31 years telling people exactly how fast desert floodwater moves once it has nowhere to spread. My grandfather's berm would have turned that water wide, out across open scrubland where it belonged. Instead, it went straight down the graded channel Vivian Kessler's excavator had carved 2 months earlier, and it hit the clubhouse construction pad like a fist. I watched through Hank Ruiz's binoculars as it swallowed a stack of lumber, tipped over a porta-john, and rolled on into the first row of Rio Seco estates, brown water climbing curbs, lapping at garage doors, exactly where 40 Premier View lots had been marketed with pictures of a desert sunset nobody had bothered to check would survive the season. My own land, up on the ridge, stayed exactly as dry as it had been an hour before the storm. "On the record," Hank Ruiz said quietly beside me, already writing. "Flood event, Alamo Seco Arroyo. Direct correlation to unpermitted removal of historic flood control structure. Subject property, Rio Seco Estates." That's when we saw the Range Rover come skidding down the access road toward the construction trailer, brakes squealing in the mud, and Vivian Kessler got out into ankle-deep water in those same 4-inch heels. No clipboard this time, just a laptop bag clutched against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her afloat. Priya Chandra's camera was already rolling when Vivian reached the trailer, yanked the door open, and started pulling folders out of a filing cabinet, throwing them onto the floor, feeding pages into a small paper shredder plugged into a generator that was somehow still running despite the water rising around its base. "Ma'am," Deputy Ellery called out, wading toward the trailer. "I need you to step away from that shredder." She didn't. That's the part I still think about. She had every chance in that moment to simply stop, to say nothing, to let the flood be a flood and nothing more. Instead, she kept feeding pages through, faster, and when the deputy reached the doorway, she actually shouted at him over the noise of the machine, "This is a private business record. This is none of your concern." "Miss Kessler," I called out from the doorway, my phone already up, recording, the same way it had been recording the day Dorothy's ramp came down. Those records were named in a formal written notice sent to this association 11 days before this flood. You're destroying evidence in an active floodplain violation investigation. Here's what most homeowners don't know. Under Texas Penal Code Section 37.09, tampering with or destroying a document with knowledge that an investigation is pending or in progress is a felony offense, regardless of whether you technically own the document. It doesn't matter whose letterhead is on it. Once a government body has requested those records, or you have reason to believe they will, shredding them is a crime, not a business decision. Deputy Ellery stepped into the trailer, put a hand gently but firmly on the shredder's power cord, and pulled it from the generator. The machine wound down with a dying whine. "Vivian Kessler," he said, "you're under arrest for evidence tampering. You have the right to remain silent." She looked past him, straight at me, standing in the doorway with brown floodwater swirling around my boots and my phone still recording. And for just a moment, the mask came all the way off. No clipboard, no smile, nothing left but a woman standing ankle-deep in the consequences of a decision she'd made 2 months earlier on top of an excavator. "You did this," she said. "No, ma'am," I said. "You did this. I just made sure somebody official was standing here to watch." They walked her out in handcuffs past a row of flooded garages, past neighbors standing on their porches filming on their own phones, past Dorothy Vance, who'd been driven down by a neighbor to watch from the sidewalk, oxygen tube looped over her ears, sitting in a folding lawn chair with her hands folded in her lap like she was watching a parade she'd waited a long time to see. The investigation that followed took 4 months, and it went a great deal further than a shredder and a flooded clubhouse pad. Once county forensic accountants pulled the HOA's full financial records under subpoena, the picture I'd found in that courthouse basement widened into something much bigger. Sunbelt Advisory Group LLC, registered to Vivian's sister, had received $840,000 in consulting fees for engineering work that state licensing records showed had never actually been performed by anyone with a valid Texas engineering license. The 40 Premier lots, pre-sold to Cortland Ridge Partners buyers for a combined $6.2 million, had been marketed and contracted without disclosure of the recorded 1908 drainage easement, a material omission that, under Texas real estate fraud statutes, exposed both Vivian and Cortland Ridge Partners to liability for every single one of those pre-sale contracts. Vivian Kessler pleaded guilty to felony theft by a fiduciary under Texas Penal Code Section 32.45, evidence tampering under Section 37.09, and securities fraud tied to the pre-sale contracts. She was sentenced to 7 years, with restitution set at $7,040,000, $6.2 million returned to defrauded pre-sale buyers through a court-appointed receivership, and $840,000 repaid directly to the Rio Seco Estates Homeowners Association General Fund. She served 18 months before parole. Her sister, who'd accepted the Sunbelt advisory payments without performing any actual work, pleaded to a lesser charge and paid $110,000 in restitution of her own, on probation. Cortland Ridge Partners settled with the county and the defrauded buyers for an undisclosed sum and was barred from bidding on any development contract in that county for 10 years. The contractor who'd cut through Dorothy's ramp, the man in the golf shirt, testified for the state in exchange for immunity, and I understand he still calls Dorothy every Christmas to apologize. I never had to file a single lawsuit of my own. I never rebuilt a thing. I simply presented the 1908 easement, the county's own recorded plat, and the HOA's own signed demolition permit to the county attorney's office and let them ask the obvious question none of the board members had an answer for. If you granted yourselves permission to remove a flood control structure you didn't own, on land you had no easement across, whose fault was it when the water came back exactly where it had always wanted to go? The new HOA board, reorganized under court supervision that fall, voted unanimously to install Dorothy Vance as interim president. She held her first meeting from a folding table in the same construction trailer, oxygen tank parked beside her chair, and one of her first official acts was to authorize funding, real funding, drawn from recovered restitution for a proper permanent ramp at her own house, and 6 others in the neighborhood that needed one. I still haven't rebuilt my grandfather's berm. I don't have to, and there's a particular kind of peace in that. The land above the Arroyo sits exactly as dry and quiet as it always has, cottonwoods swaying over 3 generations of Dunmore graves, the mesquite table in my kitchen holding up under another season of breakfasts. Some evenings I walk down to the fence line and look at where that old earthwork used to run, and I think about Silas riding into town in 1908 with mule sweat still on his hands, taking the time to file one piece of paper nobody thought would ever matter again. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's a short list. Document everything, the moment it happens, with a timestamp nobody can argue with. Read the recorded history on your own land before somebody else rewrites it for you. Patience beats panic every single time, because the law moves slow, but it moves certain. And never ever assume the quiet old man in the cracked windshield truck doesn't know exactly what he's holding. I thought that was the end of it, I really did. Right up until the day a lawyer for Cortland Ridge Partners bankruptcy trustee called me about something else buried in that cedar box, a second document from 1911 that had absolutely nothing to do with water. The lawyer's name was Preston Alvarez, and he called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was mending fence wire near the south pasture, my hands still smelling of grease and rust when I finally wrestled my phone out of my shirt pocket. "Mr. Dunmore," he said, "I represent the bankruptcy trustee for Cortland Ridge Partners. We're liquidating remaining assets, and in the course of that we pulled title history on a parcel adjacent to your property. There's a document referenced in the chain of title we can't locate the original of. A mineral rights reservation, filed 1911, grantor Silas Dunmore." I stood there a long moment with a pair of fence pliers hanging loose in my other hand, watching a hawk circle low over the Arroyo. And I didn't say anything at first because I was trying to remember whether I'd ever actually opened the bottom of that cedar box all the way, or whether I'd just always assumed the water easement was the only thing worth keeping in it. "I'll have to look," I told him, and I meant it. That evening I drove into town and told Dorothy about the call, because by then she'd become something like a fixture at my kitchen table on Sunday evenings. The two of us going over HOA paperwork together at her request, since I was, in her words, the only man in this county who reads the fine print for fun. She laughed when I told her about the mineral rights. "Walt Dunmore," she said, shaking her head, oxygen tube hissing softly. "Your grandfather really did think of everything, didn't he?" "Looks that way," I said. Out in the yard, the plywood ramp I'd built the morning her old one got cut apart was long gone, replaced now by a proper aluminium one paid for out of the recovered restitution fund, sturdy enough that she came and went from her own porch these days without a second thought. She still watered those same 3 rose bushes every morning at 7. Some habits, once they're built right, just hold. The neighborhood itself had changed more than I expected it to. I still remembered the way half of Rio Seco estates used to look right through me at the mailboxes those first few months, treating me like the cranky rancher holding up progress on their property values. Now when I drove through to check on Dorothy or drop off eggs from my hens, people waved from their driveways. A man named Cole Whitfield, who'd bought one of the original view lots and lost his deposit in the fraud before getting it returned through the receivership, stopped me outside the new clubhouse, smaller now, modest, built to actual code with actual permits, and shook my hand so hard I felt it in my shoulder the next day. "We used to think you were the problem out here," he admitted, a little sheepish. "Turned out you were the only one reading the surveys right." I didn't say much back. 31 years with the state teaches you that vindication doesn't need a speech. It just needs time and paperwork, and somebody willing to wait for the sky to prove a point you already knew was true. Still driving home that night past the graded pad where 40 premier lots had once been promised, and where, now, native grass was slowly reclaiming the scarred red dirt, I found myself thinking less about Vivian Kessler and more about that cedar box waiting on my kitchen table, and a 113-year-old document I hadn't even known existed until a bankruptcy lawyer's phone call. My grandfather Silas, it turned out, had left behind a great deal more paper than I'd ever given him credit for.